Morning guys, Dave Canterbury with the Pathfinder School. I made a video a while ago about making a crooked knife per the instructions in a couple different old woodcraft manuals. I think Ellsworth Yeager's got a diagram in his, as well as Bernard Mason. And this is a fairly reasonable facsimile of a right-handed crooked knife. Now, it's not a traditional Mocotaugan or crooked knife that were used by the Native Americans. And I did a video yesterday on this one by William Collins that I got. And it is very similar in handle design to a hoof knife. The blade design is very similar to a hoof knife. However, a Mocotaugan was a little bit different than that in handle design, and the blades were different as well. They were modified to the user. So a lot of guys have asked, well, A, did the hoof knife come and then the Mocotaugan was copied off of that, or vice versa? And also, can I just use a hoof knife as a common man solution to a crooked knife or a Mocotaugan? So, a couple things. First of all, to the question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. There's really not a lot of solid research on the metal Mocotaugan. There is some research done on different Mocotaugans or crooked knives that were made by Native Americans, that were speculated to be made by stone, and also by like beaver incisor teeth left in the jaw to use as a scraping device or a pulling type draw knife device. So that portion of the Mocotaugan would definitely be of Native American design. Now I would suspect that because the Native Americans were introduced to metal and metallurgy by the Europeans, it is distinctly possible that a hoof knife could have been somewhat a factor in the design of the current Mocotaugan that's made by the Native Americans, but it's also distinctly a possibility that it was not. I read a book on the Mocotaugan, and it talked about some of the implements that were repurposed to make the Mocotaugan by Native Americans, and it included things like files, which is a normal knife making steel that was chosen by lots of people, and also they talked about razor blades, like straight razor blades and things like that, which that makes a lot of sense to me, that a straight razor blade would make a good Mocotaugan because it is bevel ground on one side, basically a chisel grind type blade, just like a draw knife is. So I suspect that, we may never find out which came first, the chicken or the egg, in the truest sense of the word, as far as a metal Mocotaugan goes, because it could have been adapted from lots of things, or it could have been adapted from something that was in his head. It's hard to say. The question in my mind is, can we take a hoof knife and make it an adaptable Mocotaugan for the common man? Obviously, you can buy these made in traditional fashion. This William Collins is a very close facsimile, other than the handle design, I would say. Nick Dillingham from Michigan makes a very good Mocotaugan, as well as a couple of guys in the UK make very, very nice crooked knife designs. So you can buy them, but they're very, very expensive for a common man type knife. It's something that you would want to buy if you were buying a lifetime tool. I would compare it very much to like an old hickory butcher knife versus a Pathfinder Scout or something like that, where you start with one and you advance to the other. So let's talk about taking a horsehoof knife and modifying it to make it more of a crooked knife or Mocotaugan design. Now, I went and bought one today. Just bought it at Tractor Supply. It was like 15 bucks. This is a Diamond brand. And you can see by looking at these two that the handle designs are very similar. But neither of these is truly similar to a Mocotaugan knife design handle. So what I've done is I've drawn out an area that I'm going to cut off of this handle. Now, I will also tell you that this blade from William Collins is a very hard chisel grind, very Scandinavian in the fact that it is a fairly shallow grind. And the hoof knife is completely different than that. The hoof knife has a compound bevel to a chisel grind on one side, but it is nowhere near as sharp out of the box as this knife by William Collins. So you're going to have to do a little bit of blade work on this thing as well. I suspect you can do that, most of that, with a diamond rod. We'll attempt that in a few minutes. But first, let's get this handle designed a little bit more like a Mocotaugan. Now, the other thing that you're going to have different, unless you completely rehandle this tool, is that the Mocotaugan or crooked knife, either one, no matter which drawings and things you look at, most of the time the blade was on the very bottom of the handle, insert into a mortise, and then lashed on. This one is in the center, very much like an old hickory, with 2 pins holding it in. So that will be different than the traditional Mocotaugan. The blade will be slightly higher than normal in your hand. But we're going to try to make this handle design, because this knife was really meant to be used palm up most of the time. I suspect they used it any way they needed to for carving, but it was a palm up type draw knife that was used for planing purposes. We're going to try to make this handle a little bit more like a true Mocotaugan handle. Stay with me. Okay, so what I've done here is I've just drawn a sweeping circle here on this wooden handle, so that when I wrap my hand around, there's a place for my thumb to rest. And that was very typical of a lot of the actual Mocotaugan knives that I've looked at on the web. So I'm going to cut that sweep out of there, and then we'll sand that down. Alright, so I took that chunk out of the handle and I sanded that down a little bit, and I'll work on that again more here in a minute. But right now I'm going to take this diamond rod and kind of work on this edge a little bit. Remember, I told you this edge is just a single bevel grind right there. You're probably not going to be able to get all the way inside here, but it's really, really sharp right there. I'm just more worried about this outside edge, really, than anything else. Pretty sharp. Now, one of the things that I didn't talk about yesterday that makes that knife different than other knives, not different from the hoof knife, but different from most of your carving knives, is you got it sharpened on the inside of the blade. If you look at most of your Moras and things like that, they're sharpened out here. The bevel's on the back side of the knife over here, where this is on the front side of the knife. So it's a completely different type of carving tool. Okay, so when we've got it fairly well finished up, this is what we're looking at. Now we can get that thumb rest in the back and hold that knife palm up to work with it. So let's get a piece of green wood cut and see how she cuts. Okay, I got a piece of green poplar here. And remember, most of these carving type tools were meant for carving green wood, not dry wood. Get that bark layer stripped off of there first. So this really is kind of a planing device that you can use one-handed. I don't think there's any doubt that for processing stuff down quickly, stripping bark off of materials and planing them down to shape, there's probably no doubt that this is an effective tool for that in any way. I'm not so sure that one of these hoof knives is going to give you anywhere near the same advantage a good sharp hand forged blade would give you. But I can do a pretty good job with this hoof knife too. There's a difference for sure, but there's going to be a difference, you know, when you're talking a difference of $100 on a knife. There's probably going to be a difference. So I'm not knocking this $15 facsimile either, because I think for, you know, somebody who didn't want to spend a lot of money and just wanted to play with a hook knife to see if it was something that they like or a design that they could appreciate and use, you know, I'm pretty sure that this would work for you to give you that experience. So when we look at these two tools side by side, they look very similar now that I have reshaped the handles. The main difference really is in the blade grind and of course the upturn of the blade between the two tools. But again, you know, I have read in my research that there were lots and lots of different Mocotaugans, and some of them were tightly curved like this. Some of them were wide open, flat, just curved knives. But the real difference becomes the grind, because the grind is what allows you to use this as a hand planing device, and that's really what this thing was made for, is a single-handed draw knife, to be able to take a piece of stock that was round and to plane material off of that to make it flat. And that would have been very important when making things like canoes. And you can take those fine shavings off of a piece of softer wood with this knife. Whereas with the hoof knife, because it's got a double bevel grind on it, it's a completely different animal when it comes down to trying to remove fine shavings. It's going to take thicker chunks, and you're going to get hung up in the wood like that and not get those thin slices. And you can, the more trouble you have, or the more work it becomes to try to pull that knife towards you when you're doing work or trying to accomplish a task, the more dangerous it's going to be. A dull knife is generally a lot more dangerous than a sharp knife is. And that's not to say that this knife is dull, because it's not. It's sharp, but the blade profile or the grind of this is not conducive to that fine shavings. It's not made to pull fine shavings up. It's made for chunking, for like the horse hoof and things like that, and for shaving off chunks of the frog in between the horse's hoof and things like that. It's not made for those fine carving tasks. So you're not going to get those fine shavings very well off of this like you can with that shallow grind. You can see how good that bites into the wood to pull shavings off. Alright, so I put a piece of wood in a vise here just to show you a couple things. I want you to understand that the difference in these blade grinds is the major difference. This hook being deeper on this one than it is on this one is really inconsequential, because lots and lots of Mocotaugans had different type hooks on them. Some were flat, some were bent and flat, some were hooked completely over. It really depended on what the tool was going to be used for by the maker. But in general, the Mocotaugan was used as a planing device on soft woods like cedars and things like that. So this is not a hardwood working tool, it's a softwood carving tool. But the difference in the grind here, with this being a single bevel, shallow grind, more like a Scandinavian type grind on one side, and this being a compound bevel, gives this a much thicker blade edge than this. So when you go to remove and plane with that thing like this, and I'm using both hands on this just to show you what I'm talking about, but you can see how this will grab very small shavings. You can actually get that thing and pull it towards you and grab small amounts of shavings, or you can kind of turn up and chip away at it like that. But you can also grab chunks out of there to make that flat. And that's really what where this knife shines, is in its ability to plane wood to the shapes that you want it very quickly. It can remove large chunks of material like this to shape that wood, but it can also remove fine shavings if you want it to. And that's something that you're never going to get out of a hoof knife unless you completely regrind the blade and probably reheat treat it and all of those things, because it's just a different animal. It's not made for that. It doesn't grab the wood near as well. You can hear it dragging in the wood. It'll remove material for sure, but there's a lot more effort to remove that material than there is with the other knife. And generally speaking, a dull knife is going to cut you much quicker than a sharp knife, because you're having to struggle with it to get it to do what you want. Whereas a sharp knife's not going to do that. And that's not to say this knife's not sharp. It just has a completely different type of bevel on it for a different purpose. Okay, so we talked a little bit about how to sharpen these hook style knives. You can just use a diamond rod. Works fine for these things. As far as storing the tool goes, I had a couple questions on that. The best storage method I've seen for this without making a sheath for this is by Ben Orford over in the UK. And what he does is he just uses a piece of leather, in this case I've got brain tan, and he wraps it over the blade like this and then turns it around the blade in this fashion, covering the blade with a strip of leather like this. And then at the end he just puts a 1/2 inch in there to tie it off, just like that, and stores it like that in kit. That's a pretty good method, I think. Pretty simple. You could oil and grease this leather down really good so that your tool always has a good coating of protectant on it at the same time. And I think that's just the best way that I've seen, even with people making slide-on sleeve sheaths and things like that. This is really better because it's easy to recreate, it's easy to work with. Well, guys, I appreciate you joining me here today for a quick comparison video on the Hoof knife and the crooked knife, or the Mocotaugan, and attempting to make a reasonable facsimile of one from a Hoof knife. Again, cheap alternative, 15 bucks. Not the same in any way, shape, or form. Could it be modified to be a better crooked knife or Mocotaugan? Yes, it could be, but it's going to take a lot of work. You're going to have to take the blade off, rehandle it. You're going to have to reprofile the blade, then reheat treat it, and temper it. But if that's what you choose to do, that's an option for you. Or you could buy one from a known maker, like William Collins, like Nick Dillingham, like Ben Orford, or you could attempt to make your own as well from a file or some type of 1095 or 01 tool steel. I appreciate you joining me today for this video. I thank you for everything you do for our school, for our family, and for our business. I thank you for everything you do for our sponsors, affiliates, instructors, and friends, and I'll be back with another video as soon as I can. Thanks, guys.